Again, my name is Jesse Sanders. I'm the CEO of a company called Breebug. We're located out of Denver, Colorado. We've been around since about 2009. Who here has entered in to win a brand new 15-inch MacBook Pro so far? And the rest of you just don't want a MacBook Pro, a brand new one? No? So if you haven't registered already, our booth is right directly outside of here. All you have to do is pull out your app, and it'll go ahead and we'll scan your QR code. I'm going to be drawing a winner tomorrow morning, I think right around 10:20. And so it'll be a great opportunity to win a beautiful brand new MacBook Pro. And yeah, so anyway, thanks everybody for coming. This is NgRx Mobile. So before we kind of get going here, raise of hands, who's using Ionic right now? All right, cool. Who's using Ionic with NgRx? All right, much smaller group. All right, great. Hopefully I can change your mind by the end of this and show you why you might want to consider using NgRx with your Ionic apps and how it might help you tame the beast a little bit. So for me, doing mobile apps is kind of a strange thing. So it doesn't really work the same way as when I'm building a regular web app, and I have a lot of new complexities that I have to deal with. The one thing that always surprised me about building a mobile app is that the data arrived unexpectedly when I didn't think it was going to be there. So things that I thought would load immediately would show up later, and things that I thought would take longer would almost show up instantly. And so what that would do is cause some flicker and some other really weird things. When we start to look at managing the data, we might want to cache it or whatnot. We'd get into the sinful area of creating a session service and starting to tuck stuff into there. And it worked pretty great, until it got to about 650 lines of code and things really started getting complex. And, to me, it's kind of insane how, with such a small app and such a small screen area, how things could get so complicated so quickly when developing a mobile application. So what we're going to talk about today is how we might tame that and some of the tools and tooling that we can introduce to help make our lives a lot easier when creating these Ionic apps using NgRx and Angular. So to me, these are a perfect marriage between NgRx and Ionic. In large part, NgRx really helps us simplify our applications. We can go ahead and ditch putting a bunch of data into services. Using services is great because it's a singleton and I can pass it around and use it, but the problem is that I typically just store that as raw data, and when it gets updated, then it's up to me to figure out how I get it to each one of those components. NgRx helps me solve that. Another thing that NgRx is great for is with the Cordova plugins. So you think about a Cordova plugin, they're asynchronous, they're going to return data, or they're going to return an error, and then I'm going to have a new action. I'm going to have a picture back or something along those lines. So like I said, mobile challenges, the thing that runs here is slow, no network. We have complexity trying to get all this data together, and when it's coming in disparate times, bringing that back together. So with NgRx Mobile, the bottom line here that we want to do with NgRx, we want to simplify our applications. We want to do a container presentation. Who's using container presentation in their Ionic apps right now? 2, 3, okay. 4, a couple out there. So we're going to cover container presentation a little bit as well and how you can use that to simplify your applications. If you saw me speak a little bit earlier, some of this is going to be a little bit of a recap into presentation components and container components, but we'll briefly cover over that. And then we're going to look at a lot of code. So bottom line, we want to make it easier to handle our data as it shows up and not have such complexity going on and not putting stuff out into a session service where I'm having to figure out how I bring that back into my components later. So the first thing I want to do is I want to implement NgRx. But as you all know, with Ionic apps, it's got its own CLI, right? So I'll go ahead and implement and create an Ionic app as usual, and I want to integrate the CLI. I want to integrate NgRx schematics because I don't want to have to sit here and type out entities for each and every one. And it'd also be nice to do path aliases so I can clean up my pathing, so I can move stuff around if I want to and make that super clean. And I'd like to be able to bring in libraries like Jest so I can do my testing and do snapshot testing versus regular old Jasmine testing. All right, great. So out of the box, though, there are a couple of challenges to make this all work, and so we're going to walk through a few of these on how I'd go ahead and get this set up. The first step here is I want to go ahead and run Ionic start my app. My app can be whatever I want to name my app. I just went ahead and went with the default here. And the next thing I want to do is I want to bring in the CLI. So the first thing I need to do is, since the CLI didn't generate the project, is I need to get an Angular CLI JSON file. So I can copy that from anywhere. I can just create it and then copy it over from another project. However you want to do that, it's pretty simple. Then I just want to rename the project in there so it matches. So you can see here, here's a sample Angular CLI JSON file. I just copied this from another project that I had, put this into my root, and I went in and changed with the third line there, name, my app, and that's really the main thing that needs. Some of the other stuff is a little bit more optional, but I went ahead and just copied over a file and made it easy. So that's my first step. Now, by doing that, now I can start to run CLI commands. So, but before I do that, actually, I do need to install the Angular CLI. So I'll do an npm install for Angular CLI, save that to dev. I'll go ahead and install NgRx. I want to bring NgRx in. I want to have the store. I want to have entity, effects, and schematics. That way, I've got everything I need to implement the store, and I can also then take advantage of the schematics so that I can generate entities. Who's using NgRx schematics right now? Wow, really small subset. All right, so if you're not using this already, this will save you a lot of time. So instead of having to generate out your model by yourself, your actions, your reducer, your effects, it's going to give you a baseline to work with. And so highly recommend that you take a look at the NgRx schematics. And what we're doing here for Ionic, for this app, is the same thing you would do for being able to bring it into a regular web app. All right, great. So we're also going to bring in the NgRx store DevTools and the NgRx store freeze. I want DevTools so I can take a look at how my state's changing. Who's using DevTools right now? Anybody? A few more hands. So if you're doing NgRx, it's really a mandate. You should have the DevTools. You need to see how your state's changing, and you need to make sure your state's not getting mutated. So NgRx store freeze will help you with that. It'll make sure that if you do mutate it, instead of it just kind of silently failing on you, it'll go ahead and throw an error and let you know that you've mutated state and you need to probably fix your reducer. Great. So now that we have schematics, we got the CLI, we've got everything for NgRx, we have our schematics, now I have to tell the CLI about the schematics. So I want to use ngset. This is part of the CLI, and this allows me to change one of the settings. I want to change my defaults for the schematics collection to point to NgRx schematics. So that'll still support Angular schematics, plus it'll support our NgRx schematics. So now we have both. So who's using path aliases right now? Wow, pretty small subset. So path aliases are really nice because this long .. slash .. slash, and it's like, okay, how many levels is it? And I'm always constantly having to figure out from this point in my code here, I got to get all the way back out, so then I can select something over here. So path aliases really help me clean up my code. It makes it a lot easier. I can start to move components around. If I want to move it outside of the, from one folder to another folder, and it's changing levels a little bit, I'm not going to break all of my code. Paths make it really, really nice for me to be able to do this. So where we do this at is in the tsconfig JSON. So if we take a look here, I can go ahead and add to my tsconfig JSON file, I can add a paths key and then give it each one of the ones that I want. So I want to have where all my state is held at. I want to have where my core is at. I want to have where my assets, my environment, my pages and theme. Really, pages and theme is more of an Ionic thing. And so I went ahead and added those in so I can get to those very, very easily as well. So now at this point, I've got paths configured, but actually paths still don't work. So what I just showed you there is how you would do that in a standard Angular CLI project. But the problem is how Webpack builds for Ionic is a little different. And so we're going to need to tell Webpack what to do. So Webpack is missing a little step here. We want to go ahead and create a config folder in our root and add a Webpack config file. So what's this going to do is it's going to help resolve. So you can see here about, almost 2/3 of the way down. We want to use default config based on our environment, and we want to use this resolve alias. And what this is going to do is we're actually going to point it to each one of the files again, or each one of the folders, and map those. And that way, when we go to do our build, it'll actually work correctly. Great. So now at this point, we've got aliasing, we've got our schematics, we've got the CLI integrated. We're sitting pretty good. We're almost ready to start writing some code. But before we write some code, one of the things that we want to be able to support is writing tests. So now you can use Jasmine. It's already set up for it with Ionic. You can sit down and start writing tests from the get-go. But I really like to use Jest for testing. Who's using Jest right now in their apps for testing? Wow, just a couple. Okay. So if you haven't looked at Jest, there was a talk earlier today that I did. I believe it was at 10:30 this morning. So there's a recording. You can sit down and check that out. But the main benefit for using Jest is it does snapshot testing. So instead of having to do a whole bunch of setup data and then a bunch of data so you can do your assertions to expect like it has this value, I can go ahead and use Jest and it will create snapshots for me if they don't exist. And if a snapshot does exist, it will compare what I expect against that snapshot and make my life really easy. It'll go ahead and do a diff comparison on that. If anything's different, it'll throw an error and say something's changed. And then I can loop through those and either approve to say update it or set that aside and I'll go look at it and figure it out later. So we're going to go ahead and install Jest. And to do that, we're actually just going to install Jest presets Angular. So this is going to go ahead and install the presets. It's going to install Jest itself. It's going to install TS Jest. And it's going to install the types for Jest. So with one simple install, it's going to go ahead and put all that in there for me. And then all we have to do is just a little bit of configuration so that we can get Jest to work within our app. So we're going to add a file called jest-config. You can do this either in the package JSON and just add a Jest key. And everything after the module exports would be what that key would point to. So basically, we want to say use presets from this library, the Jest preset Angular library. We want to set where our root is. And the next thing we want to do is really just point it towards where our setup Jest file is at. So the reason we have to have the setup Jest file is Jest uses JS DOM. So where Karma, what you're used to, is Karma's actually going to go ahead out and launch like a Chrome browser, right? And it's going to run all your tests in a Chrome browser. Well, Jest is a lot faster because it uses JS DOM and it doesn't actually have a browser. So it's very, very quick to run our tests. But the problem with that is it's missing a transform property that should be located on the document body style. So that's what we're going to do here. This is going to go ahead and add that property on there and go ahead and make that so that we can test our HTML. All right, great. So at this point, we're able to support running tests by running Jest. I can go ahead and generate a new entity. So this is using schematics. I can say, using the CLI, generate an entity. I want to go ahead and put it in the state folder, and I want to call it product. And in my case, I like to have them located in a folder, so I'll say flat is false. So it'll go ahead and create a product folder, and then it will create a model, a reducer, actions, effects, so on and so forth. So those files will be automatically generated, and we'll take a look at that in just a second here. I can also generate a component for Ionic. So in Ionic, a component is more like a subset of my page, where the pages are a brand new page for routing and whatnot. So I've got Ionic generate component products or Ionic generate page products, and that would generate either a page or a page that could be used, or a component that could be used by a page. So with just a little bit of installs and a little bit of config here, now we're able to support all the tooling that I would like to have from a regular Angular CLI app, and I can have it right now in my Ionic app. All right, great. So let's talk about container presentation. This is going to be a little bit of rehash, like I said, if you were in here earlier for complex forms, but the same properties, or the same principles, I should say, that apply to Ionic and that apply to Angular web apps also apply to Ionic apps. So what we want to start to do is think about dumb components versus smart components, or what we now is really termed as container components versus presentation components. Containers are worried about how do I get data and how things are going to happen. It's really all the wiring. Typically, this is going to be a page. And then your presentation component is going to be a subcomponent of the page. And presentation components are really worried about one basic thing. How do I present the data? And then if anything happens, if any sort of system event happens or any sort of user event happens, most commonly, hey, user clicked on something. User wants to, edit this guy. Okay, great. In those cases, I'm going to output those out on a event emitter and send that item back up to the parent so it can decide how to handle it. So the presentation component, the thing I didn't tell you there is that it gets all of its data via inputs. So the presentation component doesn't know anything about services. It doesn't know anything about stores. It doesn't know what you actually do once it clicks. So they'll go, okay, you clicked on me, but I'm not the one to decide. I'm going to go ahead and hand this up to my parent and allow my parent to do it. The real power in this is that now I have components that are highly reusable. I no longer have a lot of logic embedded into my presentation components that are dictating how it's supposed to work. This allows me to wire up a brand new container to it for that presentation component and change completely how that presentation component works and how that page works. I like to think about it as my boss came to me and said, hey, I got to create a brand new dashboard page that's loading data from different sources than what it typically does. And we want it to do a couple different functions than what it typically does. I could copy that container from the previous dashboard and wire that up very, very quickly, reusing all of those components. All right, so let's dig in here. We're going to spend a little bit of time looking at code and digging around and taking a look at how we implement this. And because we've talked about a lot of different concepts here, and I think it's easiest for us to dig into code. You guys good with that? All right, sounds good. So let's switch over here. Really quick, before we actually jump into the code, we got a really simple app here. Some of the features work great, some of them don't because it's in the browser. So even though I have a deal for camera to go get a picture, that doesn't really work in the browser for here. And then the geolocation piece doesn't really work so hot for demo either. In the browser, it works great on my phone. I can show you if you guys want to come up in a single line file and we can walk through and look. Obviously that's not going to work either. But we are going to look at how those are wired up and how they work. But the first step here, if we come back over to the customer, I just want to show you how this works. So we're just using a really simple JSON server here so that I don't really have any real APIs behind this. But I want to be able to show you how you could implement this and get it ready so that you could send it back to your API. So the first thing I did is I just clicked on our first record here, and I want to just change Bob to, I found out later he likes to go by Robert. So if I could type, there we go. And then I can go ahead and click Save, and I'm going to go ahead and hit back, and now it's, instead of Bob Newman, it's Robert Newman. So what we have here is a couple of page components. And then we have container, which are our container components for us. And then we also have a presentation component. So we'll take a look at those really quick, and then we'll start to jump into the effects and how we'd wire those up. All right. So as you can see here, by the way, I ran Jest before, just so we'd have it ready. You could see I went ahead and ran Jest. It ran a couple of tests here. I had 2 test suites pass, 2 total tests pass. And we'll take a look at those in a minute. So Jest is already up and working and working quite nicely. All right, so I'm going to kill that, and we're going to come over here to the customer and slide this out just slightly. So our customer is pretty simple. We have a model. This was actually generated using the schematics, and then I went back and kind of cleaned it up so it only have what I wanted in it. But with our customer, it's got an ID, a first name, a last name, pretty simple. And then I went in and I defined some actions. So this is all really standard stuff for how we do NgRx. I went ahead and decided, okay, we need to be able to load all, and on a load, or really any load, I'm going to have a success and a fail. And then I want to be able to load a single customer, I'll have a success and a fail. I want to be able to select one, I want to be able to update one. So with that, I went ahead and generated action classes for each one of these. Some of them have payloads, some of them don't. And at the very end here, I create a customer actions type with all those different types piped together there. So then the next thing I did is I went ahead and wrote my reducer for this. all pretty simple here. We're using entity adapter. Who's using NgRx entity right now? Anybody? Wow, small number. So if you haven't looked at NgRx entity, I strongly recommend that you look at it. It's great for handling relational data. It also makes it really simple for us to get data in and out of the store. In my mind, it actually makes my reducer a lot easier to work with. So I've got a couple of reducers here for, let's focus just really on the load all. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and take whatever my state is for my entities. I'm going to remove all of those out. I'm going to set loading to true, and I'm going to set my error to nothing. I got my load success, I got my load fail. So in this case here on my load success, I'm going to add all. I'm going to take the payload. Let me just get this out of the way a little bit. There we go. I'm going to take my payload of customers, and I'm going to combine that with my existing state. I'm going to go ahead and now set loading to false so I can turn off my little flipping puppies or whatever I'm doing there, to get some users some feedback. Otherwise, what I want to do is if the load fails, then I want to go ahead and return spread the existing state. I want to set loading to false, and I want to go ahead and set the error to say something like error loading customers. So pretty simple. If we come over here to the effect, here's our load all here. And basically what's happening is the actions $ here is watching for any actions that are of type customer actions load all. So when that happens, I'm going to go ahead and fire the service get customers. And then when that returns, I'm going to go ahead and map that to either one of two things. I'm going to have a load all success, and I'm going to create a new action for that and put those customers in it, or I'm going to catch the error that has occurred, and I'm going to dispatch return a new load all fail, which will then get dispatched. So there's our basics there for we've covered our action, our reducer, and our effects, and our model. So then if we go look at the UI for this, down here, I've got pages. I went ahead and just put this into the home component. So you can see here that I'm just looping over the customers that are returned, and we'll take a look at where those come from. And then I'm just implementing where it's putting the ID in and it's putting the first and last name in. So a pretty simple UI for us to do here. Now, in an ideal situation, I would have taken this data here, and I would have broken that out into a component, a presentation component, so I could take that list of customers, async pipe it into that presentation component. But honestly, I got lazy, so I didn't do it. But we'll take a look at the other page for this that does have that example. Even then, though, it's still being treated as a presentation component, or I'm sorry, as a container component. So we have an observable customer array here called customer $. And you can see in our constructor, the first thing that we're doing here is we are doing a select of get all customers. So we go ahead and set that, and on our init, we're going to go ahead and dispatch our load all. So our load all is going to go ahead and dispatch. My effect is going to go ahead and pick that up. If everything goes smoothly, I'm going to get a load all success, and now my customer $. There is set to that observable, and I now have that data. When a customer is selected, so when it's when a customer is being selected, so it's in the same HTML as this component, where I'm going to go ahead and dispatch a select on that, and then we're going to use the nav control to go ahead and push to our next page. So over here on our components, actually let's back up one step here. So now I want to go to the customer details. So now I went ahead and I clicked on one and I selected a customer. And this is where I went ahead and took the time to break this one out into a container and presentation component. So we'll take a look at this really quick. We have our customer observable for a single customer, and then I have a private member variable called customer. I do this because later what we're going to want to do is when the data comes back from the presentation component, we're going to want to put that into a local private member variable. I don't want to put that back into the store yet. I don't want to force it back down to the presentation component and get in some sort of loop thing. I just want to hold on to that data. And then you'll see here when we call the save, I'll use the private member variable of type customer versus using the observable. So in our constructor, we're going to go ahead and set that observable to be a store pipe select, we're going to get the selected customer. Let me just get this out of the way. We got too much stuff on there. And then, so there's our selector to go get that. We're not going to go out and reload the data. So in our case here, we could dispatch for a new load and we could go load by ID and do it that way. In our case, we just decided to keep it simple. We're going to use the data that's already in the store and go ahead and select that. We're not really anticipating a whole lot of conflicts here. But if you were, then you'd want to go ahead and dispatch a load by ID and handle it that way. So as you can see here, we've got our save method. So our save is going to go ahead and handle updating this. It's going to use a partial here. Who's using partials with NgRx, the partial class? Only a couple. Okay, so the partials are how you update data. It allows you the ability to update partial of an object. You wouldn't have to update the whole thing if you wanted. In our case, we're just going to update the whole thing and pass it up as an update class, which then inherits from the partial. And then we'll go ahead and dispatch the update customer to have it update that in the store. On customer change here, what's happening is this is where the presentation component is watching for the form value changes, and it's emitting the event back up to the parent. So this is coming in on the output and going back up to the parent. We're going to watch for that change, and that's when we're going to take the customer data that has changed and put that into our local variable. If you notice, that's what we're using in our save method is the local member variable, not the observable data, right? All right. Now if we come over here to take a look at, on the component, here's my customer details. This is where I'm actually doing all the rendering. Is this the right one? Yes. Oh yeah, so we've got inputs there, okay. So this is where I'm showing my ID. I've got my first name, my last name. These are inputs. So not a whole lot going on there, but if we go ahead and come over to the other side here and look at the TypeScript for it, you can see we have the input, which is plain data. It's just a customer object that's coming down. And then we have our output, which is an event emitter, which will return a customer going back out. The first thing that we're going to do when we build this, or when it instantiates it, we're going to go ahead and build a form. And when we build that form, that code's down just a little bit here. We're going to go ahead, and this is pretty standard code. We're going to use our form builder, create a group. We're going to add ID, first name, last name. They have no default values. And we're going to go ahead and set required validators on both of them. What's actually happening, though, the piece that I want you to pay attention to that's a little different for you is value changes. So value changes is where we're detecting that the user has made a change to our data. What we want to do there is we want to pipe that to a take while it's alive. We want to skip the first one, and we want to debounce 500 milliseconds. So I don't want to get every single keystroke that the user's typing, but I do want to get the changes that the user has done and then send those back up to the parent via the output. So in this case here, I've decided that I'm not going to send up changes unless they're valid. So if it is valid, then I'm going to do a customer change. I'm going to emit the value of the data and send that back out. So this is a pretty standard way of doing things. This is really form basics for NgRx and how you might implement these to be able to get changes from your container down to your presentation component, and then from your presentation component back up to your container. By doing that, the container, again, is storing it into a local variable, and then once the user clicks on save, we can go ahead and update that data. Or if they click cancel, we haven't changed the store at all. We can go ahead and just throw that data away and then go back to the main page. All right, great. So next thing I want to show you is the plugins. So what we've looked at so far is just a really simple master detail and how we can make our data flow really simple, how we can do forms in our Ionic apps and manage those changes without automatically affecting the state and having a really nice way of handling that. The other piece I wanted to show you guys here is, and this is really, I think, what makes NgRx perfect, or at least one of the other things, is how we can use effects to do our Cordova plugins. So First one we'll take a look at here is the camera. And actually, before we come over here, I want to look at the core. I added a couple of services here. I added a camera service. So if you've ever used the camera, basically you'll know that there's a whole bunch of options that are camera options that I can set. You know, like what do I want? I want a data URL. I want encoding JPEG. The media type, I want a picture versus a video. And I can set my target width and height. You know, a bunch of properties like that you can go set on it. And then once that's done, then I want to go ahead and return from the promise the camera get picture. Great, so this is just my service call. Pretty simple, and this is going to be used by my effect. So now if we come back over here to the effect, so I want to go to my state. So let's take a look at a couple of things here really quick. I have a very simple interface for my camera. I'm going to give it an ID, and I'm going to give it some image data. So really no magic there. My actions are really simple. I either want to get a picture, and then one of two things is going to happen. Either I'm going to have picture success or I'm going to have get picture fail. So I want to have a way of handling each one of those states. So the one thing I want you to impress upon you is that everything that happens, I know I said this a little bit earlier, but everything that happens is a state. And you want to be able to recreate it. So when you're using those dev tools, you can see that, hey, they requested a picture and then that failed. Or they requested a picture and then it succeeded. So we're going to have an action for each one of those. So I went ahead and created 3 different action classes. This is all pretty standard stuff here. And then I went ahead and created a union type here of camera actions. On my reducer, oh, that's my test. On my reducer, I have get picture. I'm going to remove all of my existing state. I'm going to set loading to true and error to blank. When it's successful, I'm going to take my payload and add it to my state. I'm going to set loading to false. And if it fails, I'm going to keep whatever state I have. I set loading to false, and I'm going to set error to error reading camera. All right, great. But here's where the magic happens. So in my effect, the effect now is, once I register my effects, it is now going to watch for any time that I ask for a picture. It doesn't matter where I ask for a picture from. I don't have to pull in the camera service and redo any of this or ask it to take a picture and then figure out how I'm going to resolve it. So I can go ahead and once I dispatch a camera action of type get picture, then it's going to fire off, and we're going to go to a switch map to call the camera service to get a picture. So when I do this on my mobile phone, when I click the button to get my picture, it immediately just switches right over to my camera. Nice and simple. And then one of two things are going to happen. Either I'm going to take a picture and say use it, or I'm going to say cancel somewhere in this process, and it's going to fail. So once it comes back, I'm doing a little bit of data manipulation here. I'm giving it an ID so that I can use the entity library and put it into entity. And I'm also then modifying the image data, and I just want to prepend it with this little data image JPEG base 64 stuff so that it'll render out right. And then I'm going to go ahead and return a get picture success with that camera object. So then the reducer is going to pick that up, go ahead and put it in there. And then what we'll take a look at here in just a second is that the container has the selector getting that picture, and it's passing that picture down to the presentation component that's going to display it. So since it's an observable, it's going to immediately pick it up. I don't have to worry about passing it to that component. So we think about this in terms of if I used a session service and tried to recreate this, I'd be responsible for then trying to wire it up and get it down to that presentation component, or that presentation component, and really any presentation component that would want to render would have to have access to the service. Instead, I can do this in a RxJS/NgRx way of being able to get my data down to my components. So let's take a look really quick here. We've got about 15 minutes left. And let's go take a look at the pages for these. Okay. I didn't rename pages. I probably should have. So we'll see. Okay, perfect. I guessed right. So what I did is when I generated this app, it did a tabs app, and I didn't rename the tabs and bother to go through all of that. So for better or for worse. So I figured I could figure it out up here pretty easily. So In our case here, we're pulling in the store, we're pulling our nav controller, and we have a function called getPicture. GetPicture is called, let's see here, I have a button. When I click it, we get picture, and it has just a little label on it, get picture. So pretty simple. So when that gets fired, when that gets clicked, it's going to dispatch a get picture. It's going to immediately flip me over to the camera. I can go ahead and take my picture, and when that's done, then it's going to go ahead and update my observable. So on my init here, notice I'm actually picking up 3 different observable variables. One is the camera. This is going to be for my picture that comes back. I'm going to have a loading, so I can show some sort of loading message to the user, or I can have a flipping puppy or whatnot. And the last one is this.error is going to display any errors. So let's take a look at the HTML again here just for a second. Source, camera, image, data. Oh, so in this case here, I did not create a presentation component. I went ahead and just bound this directly in onto the camera image data, and that's what's going to go ahead and display my image. So let's take a look at one other one here really quick. Let's go look at the location. So this is a really simple call. Okay. So the call here is get current position. This is using the geolocation service on my device. I'm going to go ahead and take that promise. It's going to get converted from a promise to an observable, and that's going to get passed back. So a really simple service here on how I'd go get what my current location is. From there, if I come over to my state for this, you know, our model, I've got a couple different models here, but I believe this one here is the one I'm using is the location. And then I have actions. I want to get location, and then with a get, I'm going to have a success and a fail. I create action classes. I create a union type. Pretty simple. My reducer, oh, I always do that. Here's my reducer here. This looks almost exactly like the reducer I use for the camera. I'm going to remove my state when I go to call it. I'm going to set loading to true, error to nothing. If it comes back, I'm going to add it and set it to false, set loading to false. Otherwise, if it fails, I'm going to keep whatever state I have. I'm going to set loading to false, and I'm going to set my error to reading my geolocation. Again, I'm able to wire up what we're doing here with an effect. So now I can listen for when this button gets clicked and I dispatch the get geolocation. It'll go ahead and pick this up. It'll call my location service. So in this case here, I don't have anything flipping to a camera. It's just going to go ahead and turn on my geolocation. It's going to go ahead and get my current position. When that comes back as a position, then I'm going to go ahead and convert it over to a location. I'm going to read those coordinates and then transpose those down, and then return a new geolocation success. And again, over here on my pages, I believe this is contact. Yep. I have 3 different observables, one for my location, one for loading, one for error. When my button's called, I dispatch my get location, and that's going to go ahead and get that, return, and then once I get that back, it's doing my location right here with my async pipe, and it's feeding down, and I can go ahead and set my latitude, longitude, accuracy, and speed. All right. So really quick, I told you a little bit, I'm the CEO and founder of Breebug. What we do is we do architecture reviews, Angular training, and Angular consulting. If you haven't already entered in for the 15-inch MacBook Pro giveaway, highly recommend you can just walk right out here, pull up your app for ng-conf, and pull up your QR code for your contact scan and enter in. We're going to be giving this away tomorrow morning at, like I said, about, I think, 10:20, something like that. So with that, we've got about 10 minutes left here. Does anybody have any questions at all? We got a question back there. Does anybody recognize ASCII art? Do you guys remember that? I had to dig for that. That was
Hey, I just had a quick question about, I think it was in your about.ts page component, and you were using a syntax I'm not familiar with. It was this.store.pipe, and you're saying select in there. I was just wondering what the reason was for that, and why not just this.store.select?
Sure. There's actually two different ways of doing it. The other way, you could just go what this.store.select and then give it the selector that way. That's considered, I believe, the older way of doing it. That the new way and recommended way is to use this.store pipe and then use the select method and then pass it the selector. But for right now, you can do it either way. It doesn't really matter.
Okay, is there an advantage to the way you're doing it?
Not that I'm aware of, but if I had to guess, long term, the other one's going to go away eventually.
Oh,
Oh,
they're
is it
saying
tree shaking? What's Emma say? Tree shaking?
Oh, cool.
There you go. All right.
Anybody else with questions? Wave me down.
I had a quick question, but